I remember one September we were looking at our numbers of students in our classes, and I was trying to figure out, why don't we have very many people in grief and loss? And then I realized it's grief and loss. And most people are not really trying to think about grief and loss and are actually trying to move away from it. And this is part of our culture, that we try to stay away from anything that's related to something that would make us unhappy. And I totally understand that desire, but at the same time, grief is something that comes to us all at some point, and loss is something that comes to us all at some point. And when we try to avoid these concepts, and when we try to avoid these experiences, when they do come, we really aren't prepared to be able to deal with them, and we have a much harder time. And we have absolutely no possibility to learn the lessons that they offer. And in the classes that we have on grief and loss in the Foundation of the Sacred Stream, we really try to take the time to learn, what can we learn from grief? What can we learn from loss? And one of the things that we look at with grief and loss is how different grief and loss actually are, and how they are two completely separate things. And they need two very different ways of being. And when you're working with loss, there's an acceptance and a presence that is needed. And when you're working with grief, there's a kind of confronting of the processes of grief that need to happen, that are very different than the more expansive way of being with loss. In talking about loss, we're talking about the experience of something no longer existing in our lives as it once did. So you can have the loss of a pet, the loss of a home, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a sense of identity. These are all different types of losses where something that had one form of being no longer exists in that same form. So this is loss. And again, the experience of trying to accept that change and to create room within ourselves to accommodate that change is part of the process of learning about loss and understanding what loss has to teach us. Grief, on the other hand, is our reaction to that change. And most of us have a pretty strong set of reactions when it comes to reacting to the processes of loss. And this is what grief is. So you can have very strong emotions. You can have anger, you can have hatred, you can have denial, you can have rejection, you can have fury, you can have all these different strong reactions, or you can have numbness, you can have some strong reaction that is part of the grief process. And I actually think the word grief is a word that is a description of an emotional state. And I think it's the most complex emotional state that humans experience. And so learning how to break down that emotional state into the individual emotions that are woven into the reaction of grief is what we look at when we're doing our meditations on grief in this class, so that we can actually be present with the experience of loss in a way that is more consciousness producing, more happiness producing, and provides us with an opportunity for growth that we would not have if we were lost in all the reactivity of grief. And in the Worlds Beyond Death class, which is a very actually in-depth look at the way in which Buddhism and shamanism approach the worlds beyond death, we do visit other forms of spirituality and other philosophies about how to approach death. We look at some near-death experiences and the reportings of those experiences. But in the Worlds Beyond Death class, we really begin to examine, what does it mean to even consider that there might be a world beyond death? What if we were to step outside of the sort of rational, empirical, materialistic paradigm that says there is nothing beyond death? And what if we were to consider what our experience might be if there is something beyond the world beyond death? And in shamanism, this is a subject that has been considered for millennia in many different forms and in many different cultural contexts, and we take a look at that. And then, of course, Buddhism is a technology, or offers a technology for navigating the worlds beyond death with grace and spaciousness. And Buddhism itself even views the processes of death as a challenge to one's practice and as a test of how one has lived one's life. And so it's very interesting to explore this new way of looking at death. And again, it's a nice counterpoint to the way in which our culture tends to think about death and tends to avoid thinking about death. And it gives students an opportunity to step into a greater sense of empowerment, a greater sense of courage, stepping away from the constriction of fear that generally lies around all of these subjects, grief, loss, and death, and helps us be able to identify how we can learn from our experience of these not very well understood processes so that we can become more empowered, more happy, and so we can live a fuller life.